One evening, I sat at our dining table, sorting through the paperwork for my daughter Lisa's upcoming start to kindergarten in Evanston, a suburban area near Chicago. She had just gone through a full checkup with her pediatrician, and I was flipping through her medical forms. Nearby, Maeve, my wife, had left some of her school paperwork spread across the table too. My eyes drifted over the pages, mostly unfocused, until a single line on Lisa's form pulled me up short. In the blood type section, it read A. I froze, my mind blank for a solid 10 seconds. Then, almost in a daze, I went to the cabinet where we kept our medical records and found the documents from the last time Maeve and I donated blood. Both papers confirmed what I'd remembered. My blood type was B, Maeve's was O. With her being Lisa's mother, there was no way Lisa could have type A blood. I was there when Maeve gave birth to Lisa, but this line on her medical record made it clear that someone else, someone with blood type A, was Lisa's biological father. Our two kids were already asleep upstairs, and Maeve was in the bedroom watching TV. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, slipped outside, and took a seat in the backyard, letting the night air cool my shock. Thoughts of my marriage flooded in, a strange mix of nostalgia and numb disbelief. I'd say things between Maeve and me were fine, maybe just average. We had our ups and downs like anyone else. When we'd first started dating, we were deeply in love, with a passion that spilled over everywhere, holding hands, exchanging long looks, affectionate touches even in passing. But over the years, that intense connection faded, which I thought was just the natural course of things. Now, though, faced with the undeniable proof of her infidelity, everything I believed about our marriage was crumbling. I found myself replaying the years, asking when it all began to fall apart. I realized it started slowly, then sharply, around 6 years ago, a few months before Lisa was conceived. Maeve, usually warm and open, had started acting strangely. One evening, she came home late, kissed me briefly, almost distractedly, and disappeared into the shower, where she stayed far longer than usual. The next morning, she was distant, her warmth gone. But that very night, she surprised me, coming home early, cooking us a special dinner, and later, making love to me with a passion I thought we'd lost. We cuddled afterward, with Maeve whispering that she loved me, her voice soft and tender. For the rest of that week, she was affectionate, attentive, almost like she was making up for something. And then, just as suddenly, that warmth vanished again. She started coming home late again, silent, brushing me off, and vanishing into the shower without a word. For the next 2 months, I hardly recognized her. She'd alternate between being loving and distant, affectionate and preoccupied, patient and irritable. I asked her several times if something was wrong, whether it was with us or with her work. Her only answer was that she felt off, maybe a little stressed, and she'd apologize, almost dismissively. Eventually, she seemed to settle, but she was different. She stopped being affectionate, and any interest in intimacy faded. From then on, we only made love occasionally, usually when I pressed the issue. Even a gentle suggestion was often met with a sharp rebuff, so I felt like I had to almost negotiate any rare moments of closeness. And though I tried to ignore it, the tenderness was gone. Maeve would go along with it as if she were merely appeasing me. I wondered if this dismal pattern was normal in marriages, especially once kids entered the picture. I had no other experience to draw from, so I assumed it was. But looking back now, with the knowledge that Lisa wasn't biologically mine, everything Maeve had done 6 years ago came into sharper focus. Her distant behavior, those rushed showers, that sudden intensity, all of it made sense if she'd started an affair around that time. Maybe her bouts of affection were born out of guilt, or maybe they were part of an attempt to keep up appearances and convince herself that things were still fine between us. Sitting in the backyard, watching the night settle and stars begin to glint through the trees, my shock gradually gave way to anger. Maeve, the woman I'd loved and trusted, hadn't just betrayed me. She'd deceived me into believing Lisa was my daughter, allowing me to raise another man's child, perhaps even without remorse. If all I'd wanted was to confront her, I could have stormed into the house right then, thrown those blood type records down in front of her, demanded answers, and ended everything. But it wasn't that simple. Life, especially with 2 young kids, never is. I loved my kids regardless of their biological origins, but I knew that if Maeve and I ended up divorcing, she'd probably gain full custody once the truth about their parentage came to light. So I took a moment to ask myself, what do I really want here? The answers became surprisingly clear. First, I needed the whole truth about Maeve's actions. Was it just a one-time mistake? Did she genuinely not know that Lisa wasn't mine, or had she hidden a long-term affair from me? Second, no matter what I discovered, I wanted to continue raising Lisa and Jake as my own children, protecting them from the truth of my non-biological connection to them. Once I defined my goals, I felt like a plan came to me almost instinctively. Quietly, I went back into the house, where the kids were sleeping, and used cotton swabs to take samples from each of their cheeks, labeling Lisa's with a 2 and Jake's with a 3. Then I swabbed my own cheek and marked it as 1. I had a friend working in a university chemistry lab who owed me a favor, so I reached out to him, setting up a discreet DNA test. This was just the first step, a way to gather the information I needed to move forward. About a week later, my friend called with the results. He didn't know who the samples belonged to, and I'd kept it vague, saying I'd met people with the same last name and wanted to see if we might be distantly related. Over the phone, he told me that samples 2 and 3 were definitely siblings, but 1 wasn't related to either of them. That meant Lisa and Jake shared both parents, and neither one of those parents was me. My initial guess had been right. Maeve had 2 children with someone else. I thanked him for his help and hung up, feeling a cold, hard certainty settle in. So, Maeve had to know. She must have been aware of her relationship with this other man, but did she know he was the biological father of our children? There was only one way to find out. That evening, as Maeve was washing dishes in the kitchen, I brought it up without looking directly at her. I told her I had a question, and she nodded for me to continue. I explained that a friend's colleague, a biologist, was working on a family study and needed DNA samples from relatives. I casually suggested that we take swabs from her, me, and the kids, thinking it could be handled before bed. I watched her carefully as I spoke, and halfway through my explanation, she froze, nearly dropping the pan in her hands. She quickly composed herself, but her body remained tense. When I finished talking, there was a long silence. Then she turned to me and voiced her concerns, questioning how we could trust this biologist and what might happen to our privacy. I tried to reassure her, but she was firm, refusing to participate and asking me to let my friend know we weren't interested. I told her it was fine, that it didn't really matter, but her reaction had told me everything I needed to know. The next step was finding out more about her affair, who it was, when it began, where it happened, and maybe even why. I figured I'd need to search the house to uncover any clues. On Saturday, we had plans to visit her parents. Just before we were about to leave, I pretended to get a work emergency call. I explained to Maeve that I had to stay behind to handle it, and after a little convincing, she left with the kids. This gave me hours alone in the house to conduct a careful search. I ruled out my usual areas and focused on Maeve's spaces instead, skipping the kitchen, bookshelves, and living room. I searched her closet and dresser carefully. A stash of hidden lingerie hinted at secrets, but it didn't give me any concrete answers. Only the children's rooms and the attic remained. Deciding the kids' rooms were less likely, I made my way up to the attic. Up there, I found old furniture, a few lamps, and several boxes of things from before our marriage. One of the boxes caught my attention. It looked like it had been moved recently, the dust slightly disturbed. Digging through, I uncovered some of Maeve's old belongings, mainly letters from her college days. I found cards and mementos from our early relationship, buried among other items. But near the bottom of one box, hidden beneath stacks of paper, I came across a slim collection of recent notes and 2 unmarked videotapes. I took them downstairs and popped one tape into the VCR. The screen flickered to life, and there they were, Maeve and her office supervisor, Ron, in intimate scenes. The setting of the earlier recording looked like Ron's home, and the more recent one was in our own bedroom, confirming my suspicions about what she'd been up to during my business trips. The notes with the tapes were from Ron as well, filled with suggestive messages. He'd written instructions about what Maeve should wear on certain days, described their encounters in graphic detail, and even mocked me for unknowingly raising their children. With each note, it became painfully clear that their relationship wasn't born of any affection, it was one-sided, with Ron asserting control and Maeve willingly complying. They knew about the children's paternity and took satisfaction in keeping it hidden from me. My anger flared as I realized the extent of her deception. Maeve had been conceiving children with another man, hiding it all behind the guise of a loving wife. Ron, still happily married to his own wife, Eva, seemed to have no intention of acknowledging the children as his. Maeve, from what I could tell, wasn't forced into any of this. She seemed to relish playing the submissive role. Holding those tapes and notes, I realized that Maeve's betrayal was more extensive than I'd imagined. For 6 years, she'd knowingly deceived me, using my love for her and our family as a cover for her affair with Ron. Filled with rage, I resolved to seek revenge on both of them. After a moment, I slid the other tape into the VCR, letting the footage play out, confirming once again how they'd twisted our marriage into a lie. The recordings left little room for doubt about Ron's control over Maeve and her eager compliance. The lighting was low, but both of them were clearly visible, and the sound quality was good enough that every word, even every moan, came through. From the start, I could hear Ron taking charge, seated on the bed as he directed Maeve to perform a slow, teasing strip for him. She complied with a smile, her movements lacking any hint of affection or tenderness, and his words were harsh. It hurt to watch, but it was undeniable that Maeve seemed to enjoy the roughness of it all. The second tape showed more of the same, but this time, the conversation between them caught my attention. As they lay on the bed, Maeve asked him how he felt about me raising his children. His response was chilling. He thought I was a good guy who loved kids, so it didn't concern him. He even suggested that if it weren't for my stability, he'd have told her to leave me long ago. Maeve seemed conflicted, almost defending me, mentioning that I was kind and loving, unlike his abrasive nature. Still, she admitted she was drawn to his roughness because it contrasted with my gentleness. Despite her words, the two of them went right back to it, continuing as if nothing else mattered. After watching both tapes, I was left stunned by their sheer arrogance, not just in creating this evidence but in carelessly leaving it, along with Ron's notes, somewhere I could eventually find. I knew that my revenge needed to be complete, targeting them both. I scanned each note onto my hard drive, preserving every damning word. Using some software I'd borrowed for a previous project, I converted each video into a digital file, storing everything on my hard drive for potential editing later. Once finished, I stashed the tapes and notes in the trunk of my car, hidden under the spare tire. I then meticulously put everything back in the attic, making sure it looked untouched so Maeve wouldn't suspect a thing. For the next 2 weeks, I went about my life with Maeve as if nothing unusual had happened. It was surprisingly easy, given that she had deceived me for years. Now I was just returning the favor. I acted affectionate, even initiated moments of closeness occasionally, though my heart was far from it. Truthfully, I had no desire to touch her ever again. Then came an opportunity one couldn't pass up. Maeve had recently been elected president of the Key Society, a prominent local charity, and she was set to assume her role officially at an upcoming luncheon. She was nervous about her speech, especially the PowerPoint she wanted to use, and asked if I'd help her put it together. For nearly a week, we worked side by side each evening, going over her slides and organizing her materials into a polished presentation. She rehearsed multiple times in the weeks leading up to her big day, everything running smoothly. While she prepared, I created an entirely different presentation of my own, ready to replace hers at the last moment. The night before the event, I deleted Maeve's original file, substituted it with mine, and added a lock to prevent her from stopping the playback. To ensure everything was in place, I casually asked Maeve if Ron and his wife would be attending the luncheon. She confirmed they'd be there, which sealed my plan. On the big day, I played my part well. Maeve looked stunning, dressed in a sleek black gown that radiated confidence. I helped her set up the laptop, even ran a few tests, acting every bit the supportive husband. We enjoyed a fine dinner and listened to some introductory speeches. Then, with applause filling the room, Maeve was warmly introduced by the outgoing president, and she approached the podium, a blend of pride and nerves on her face. She began her speech as planned, starting the PowerPoint presentation alongside it. The first slides went off without a hitch, showing images of the society's projects and financial highlights. But then, just as I'd orchestrated, the presentation took an unexpected turn. A series of still photos filled the screen, frames I'd taken from the tapes, showing Maeve and Ron in compromising, intimate positions. Some images were dim, but a dozen or so left no room for doubt. Everyone in the room could tell it was them. Maeve kept speaking, unaware of the images behind her until a ripple of gasps and whispers spread through the crowd. Finally, she glanced at the screen, and the shock on her face was undeniable. She froze, accidentally knocking over a glass of water on the podium. Her face turned a deep shade of red as she fumbled to stop the presentation, but by then, the still photos had transitioned into brief video clips. Ron's voice filled the room, questioning how they would keep me from finding out she was carrying his child. He casually suggested that as long as she allowed me a little intimacy here and there, I'd never suspect a thing. He reminded her that she was his and that she should remember her place. The room broke into laughter and scattered jeers. Maeve stood there, paralyzed, too stunned to feel even the slightest embarrassment. Across the room, Ron's wife, Eva, grabbed a vase of flowers and smashed it over Ron's head before storming out. As people began to file out of the ballroom, they cast glances at Maeve, some shaking their heads, others snickering. The spectacle was seared into their minds. Eventually, the room emptied, leaving just Maeve and me. She stood on the podium, looking utterly defeated, and from my seat just a few feet away, I couldn't help but let a smile play across my lips. After a long moment, she looked over at me, her expression a mix of pain and disbelief. She asked how I could betray her like this and said she thought I loved her. The irony struck me so hard that I laughed out loud, shaking my head as I walked out, telling her that any love I'd once had was long gone. But as satisfying as that fantasy was, I knew it wasn't practical. Publicly humiliating Maeve and Ron would damage not just them but also my kids. People would gossip, branding Lisa and Jake as illegitimate. Worse, such exposure might make custody more difficult if we divorced. I realized that I'd have to be more discreet in my approach. Taking the next logical step, I contacted a divorce attorney, and together, we started laying out the groundwork for the legal steps ahead, preparing the documents I'd need when the time came to set everything in motion. I decided not to wait until Maeve's big charity dinner to show her the presentation. Instead, about 4 weeks before the event, after the kids had gone to bed, I asked her to take a look at the PowerPoint I'd prepared for her upcoming speech. When I called her into the office, she sighed, looking worn out, and asked if it could wait until later. Firmly, I told her it couldn't, reminding her that I'd spent my spare time on this for her. She reluctantly followed me and took a seat in front of the computer. I instructed her to press the letter A when she was ready, mentioning that the slides would start automatically. Inside, I could barely contain my satisfaction as I watched her reaction unfold. At first, everything went as expected, with Maeve rehearsing her lines over the initial slides. Then, suddenly, she gasped, her face going pale as the screen displayed still images of her and Ron in compromising situations. She turned toward me, her mouth hanging open, stunned into silence. I held her gaze, expressionless, as video clips followed, capturing their private conversations about the children's paternity and the years of deception. As the scenes played out, Maeve tried frantically to stop the presentation, but I'd made sure she wouldn't be able to interrupt it. After a few agonizing minutes, the screen finally went dark. Maeve slumped in her chair, her head bowed, unable to look at me. After a long moment, she lifted her head, her eyes filled with remorse. She seemed like she'd aged 20 years in those few minutes. "Daniel, I'm so sorry," she choked out, sobbing. "Can you ever forgive me?" "Forgive you?" I replied icily. "For what exactly? For an affair with Ron that spanned our entire marriage? For having 2 children with him while leading me to believe they were mine? For mocking and disrespecting me behind my back? Or maybe for denying me any closeness, as he directed?" My words seemed to deepen her anguish, and her sobs grew louder. "Daniel, I don't love him," she insisted through her tears. "You're the one I love. You always have been." My anger simmered just below the surface, but I kept silent, thinking, "No, Maeve, you don't love me. You love the comfort and stability I provide, the way I care for you and the children. But you certainly don't love me, not after what you've done." I leaned back, letting her weep, and relished her distress as I watched in silence for nearly 20 minutes. Eventually, she wiped her eyes, took a shaky breath, and looked at me. "What are you going to do, Daniel?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you going to divorce me?" "No, Maeve," I replied, lying with a calmness I didn't feel. "I care too much about Lisa and Jake, even if they aren't biologically mine." I let the words sink in, then added, "But things are going to change. You can be sure of that." I paused, then continued, "Now, call Ron and tell him to come over. He has 15 minutes. Her eyes widened in horror. I can't, Daniel. He's at home with his wife and kids. He won't come." "Tell him whatever you have to," I said, a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "But make it clear that if he's not here in 15 minutes, his marriage will be over by tomorrow." Maeve hesitated, unnerved by the coldness in my tone. Without another word, she went to the kitchen, dialed Ron's number, and made the call. When Ron arrived, he wore the nervous, insincere smile I'd expected. Clearly, Maeve had briefed him because he looked apprehensive. I directed him and Maeve to sit in the office. All right, Ron, I began without delay. You've had your fun with Maeve, making a fool of me all these years. But things are different now. It's time for you to face some consequences. Ron opened his mouth to respond, but I silenced him with a look. Sit down and listen, I commanded. I started the PowerPoint presentation, and as it played, I watched his face twist in shock and horror at what he saw. When the presentation ended, a heavy silence filled the room. Surprisingly, I found myself enjoying the moment far more than they did. From now on, you'll do exactly as I say, I told him. If you don't, your supposedly happy marriage to Eva will be over by the end of the week. Understand? Just nod. No talking. Ron clenched his jaw but gave a slow, reluctant nod. Good. Now, listen carefully. I pulled out a set of documents. I have several things here for you to sign. You'll have 48 hours to review them with your lawyer if you want, but if they aren't returned signed, Eva will be watching a clip of that tape you starred in. The first document was an acknowledgement that Ron was the biological father of Lisa and Jake, committing him to pay child support until they turned 21, as well as a lump sum for their college education. The amounts are listed here, I continued. $10,000 per child per year, plus $100,000 per child for their first year of college. The money will go into a trust fund, with me as the trustee, to be used solely for their needs. Ron erupted from his chair, his face red with fury. This is insane, Daniel. There's no way I'm. I pushed him back into his seat with a firm hand. Shut up, Ron. We both know you can afford it. This isn't your show anymore, it's mine. Now sit down and stay quiet. Across the room, Maeve stared at me, horrified. She'd never seen this side of me, the cold, resolute husband who was done being deceived. I ignored her reaction and continued with the second document. This one grants me permission to adopt the children. You and Maeve will both need to sign it. The third document formally renounced Ron's parental rights, forbidding him from ever revealing his paternity to anyone. The final paper was a personal statement admitting that he had exploited Maeve in the workplace, coercing her into an affair. Ron exploded again. That's ridiculous. She wanted it as much as I did. Sit down, Ron, I said firmly. Maybe she did, but Maeve will still be filing a complaint for workplace exploitation if you don't cooperate. Isn't that right, Maeve? Maeve looked between Ron and me, clearly rattled. She nodded weakly, unable to meet Ron's eyes. Yes, that's right. Just to be clear, I said, looking at both of them, I don't plan to act on these documents for now. Think of them as insurance, Ron, in case you ever try to avoid your financial obligations to our children or decide to reveal the truth to anyone. Consider this a warning. With that, I handed Maeve the complaint document. Sign it, I instructed. She obeyed, her face pale as she added her name to the page. Now, Ron, I said, standing up, you have 48 hours to bring these documents back to me, signed. You can deliver them here. And in case you're thinking of trying anything, know that copies of all the incriminating evidence are safely stored, ready to be shared if necessary. With one final look of disdain, I finished, any questions? Guiding Maeve back to our office, I seated her and looked into her wide, fearful eyes. She was shaking with distress, but I forced myself to remain calm. Don't worry, Maeve, I told her softly. I would never do anything to hurt you. You have nothing to fear from me. Daniel, what's happened to you? She asked, her voice filled with shock. How could you treat Ron like that? I looked at her, genuinely surprised. Do you really not understand, Maeve? Don't you see that what he did to us is unforgivable? She blushed, nodding slightly. Yes, but, you're so furious, like you've lost all sense of reason. I sat in silence for a moment, uncertain of how to respond. Maeve, I've told you I won't divorce you, I finally said. But our marriage is going to change drastically. Do you understand that? She nodded, eyes full of remorse. Yes, Daniel. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. I want to fix this. All right, I replied, my tone firm. First, let's set a few conditions. Within the next 2 weeks, you're going to find a new job. I won't allow you to keep seeing Ron every day at work. It should go without saying, but you're to have no further contact with him, no touching, no calls, no emails. Nothing. She swallowed, nodding. Of course. And if we're going to try and make this work, things are going to be very different. I won't tolerate any more coldness or indifference from you. I expect you to be cheerful, kind, and affectionate every day. If you truly love me, show it. No more withholding or keeping parts of yourself hidden. You have a lot of ground to make up for. She crossed the room, sank to her knees in front of me, and wrapped her arms around my legs. I love you, Daniel, more than words can say. I'll prove it to you. Looking down at her tear-streaked face, I could still see traces of the love and devotion I'd once felt for her. But they were buried deep under the resentment I felt toward her for her selfishness and betrayal. She deserves whatever consequences come her way, I thought. I softened my tone a bit. Listen, Maeve, in 4 weeks, you've got that big dinner with the charity organization. Let's use the time until then to start fresh, to see if there's anything worth saving here. If things go well, that dinner can be a celebration of a new beginning for us. She nodded, hugging me tightly. Thank you, Daniel, for giving me a chance. I'll be whatever you need me to be. She leaned closer, covering me with kisses and promising to make amends. Give me 10 minutes to freshen up, and I'll start making things right, she said with a hopeful smile, rising and leaving the room. I leaned back in my chair, amused by her eagerness to please me. The next 4 weeks promised to be interesting, to say the least. I noticed she hadn't thought to ask me about the details of her affair or how long I'd known. Perhaps the shock of the evening had overwhelmed her, leaving no room for questions. Or maybe she sensed that I just didn't care anymore. As far as I was concerned, my relationship with Maeve was over, she just hadn't realized it yet. When I joined her in the bedroom a few minutes later, the bed was neatly made, the lights dimmed, and she was reclining on her side, wearing a red nightgown that left little to the imagination. She'd taken time with her appearance, and I had to admit she looked as beautiful as ever, though a bit nervous. A small bottle of lotion sat on the nightstand. In a soft, trembling voice, she called to me, her arms open, inviting me to join her. I undressed quickly and climbed into bed beside her. She kissed me with a passion I hadn't felt in years, her body warm and eager, every move filled with anticipation. For the moment, I set aside my anger, allowing myself to enjoy her closeness. Her enthusiasm was captivating, and I let her take the lead. Later, when we lay side by side, she kissed me gently on the neck and whispered goodnight. I drifted off to sleep, already anticipating similar nights in the weeks to come. The following morning, she greeted me with a smile and a loving kiss, even offering to satisfy me before breakfast. I watched her go through her morning routine, noticing how she went out of her way to take care of the kids and get them ready for the day. That evening, she prepared a special meal from a recipe she'd found, though the kids weren't too keen on trying something new. Still, she made sure they were bathed and tucked in on time so that we could spend the evening together. Our nights became a pattern of intimacy and affection, a stark contrast from the indifference I'd grown used to. Each night, she wore a different nightgown, and our time together was relaxed and unhurried. Her devotion seemed genuine, and I couldn't ignore the strange sense of happiness that came with it, despite my hidden resentment. Maeve's attention never wavered, both in the mornings and behind closed doors. My life felt like a carefully crafted illusion of happiness, covering a bedrock of mistrust and anger. 2 weeks later, I received the signed documents from Ron, and Maeve agreed to the adoption paperwork without question. My attorney expedited the process, arranging a private hearing within 10 days to finalize everything. Then, without any warning, I filed for divorce, the papers officially ending what had been a fractured marriage. One morning at work, I was surprised by a visit from Laura DeSantis, a colleague I occasionally worked with. At 28, she was 5 years younger than me and strikingly beautiful. I knew she was divorced, and while I'd noticed her occasional flirtatious remarks, I'd never let my thoughts go beyond daydreams. Until now, she was simply someone I admired from afar. Daniel, she began, I don't know what it is, but there's something different about you lately. You seem happier. More alive. Thanks for noticing, Laura, I replied with a smile. On impulse, I added, actually, it's something I'd rather not get into here. How about we grab lunch together and talk about it? Sounds great, she said, and we headed to a nearby salad bar. We found a table in the park and enjoyed the sun while we ate. The change you noticed is probably because of my marriage, I said, glancing at her. She looked surprised. And that makes you look better, she asked, intrigued. Tell me more. I gave her a brief summary. A couple of weeks ago, I discovered my wife had been having an affair with a coworker. It had been going on for years. I confronted him, told him to back off, and since then, Maeve's been bending over backward to make up for it. I paused, smiling slightly. The thing is, Laura, she thinks she can win me back, but I've already made up my mind. I'll be leaving her soon. I can't stay with someone who betrayed me like that. But in the meantime, she's treating me like a king, so maybe that's the change you noticed. Laura looked at me, her expression thoughtful. I'm impressed, Daniel. You're handling this a lot better than I did when I found out my ex was cheating. It took me months to get back on my feet. I'm sorry to hear that, I replied. I didn't know you'd been through something similar. I hesitated, then added, I think the difference is, I've taken control of the situation. It's going to unfold my way, not someone else's. Feeling bold, I went on, one nice thing about my situation is that even though I'm technically still married, I know I won't be for much longer. So I don't have to hold back from expressing my admiration for the beautiful woman sitting across from me. She blushed, looking away for a moment before meeting my eyes again. Well, Daniel, you've put me in an awkward spot. I didn't realize things were so straightforward. I chuckled. I'm sorry, Laura, but you're gorgeous, fun, and I've been drawn to you from the moment we met. I just never felt right about saying anything. But now, any chance you'd like to join me for dinner on Saturday? I know a little Italian place by the river with a beautiful view. Laura looked at me seriously. Daniel, I like you too, and being around you has always felt easy. But I have to ask, can I trust you? Is your marriage really over, or is this just some line to get me interested? Laura, I replied, looking her straight in the eyes, I've always been honest with you. And I've never tried to cross any boundaries before. I'm leaving Maeve in a couple of weeks, and the divorce papers will be filed that same day. There's no going back. But if this makes you uncomfortable, I understand, and I won't bring it up again. She smiled, glancing down briefly before looking back up at me. No, Daniel, I think I'll take you up on that dinner offer. Now that you've made it, I'm not about to let you change your mind. She looked at me intently, and after a moment's hesitation, I leaned in, and we shared a soft, tender kiss. It wasn't fiery or passionate, but it held a kind of quiet promise. When we parted, I couldn't help but smile, feeling like a kid experiencing something new and wonderful. When I told Maeve about my plans for a date on Saturday, it brought out a harshness in me I hadn't felt before. I told her bluntly that I'd be going out with another woman and expected her to stay home with the kids. Maeve was shocked, on the verge of tears. Daniel, she pleaded, I've been trying so hard to make things right. Can't you give our marriage a real chance? How can you go out with someone else? It's simple, Maeve. Not only did you see someone else, but you had a 6-year affair behind my back. While you may have been trying lately and I'm feeling a bit better, that doesn't mean you automatically deserve my loyalty. I'll be finding enjoyment elsewhere before we're on equal ground. Her eyes filled with tears. Are you going to sleep with her? No, but I could, and that's what you need to understand. If it hurts you to think about it, then maybe you'll begin to understand the pain you caused me. With that, I left the room, ending the conversation. My early outings with Laura were delightful yet careful. We took it slow, both of us sensing something deeper than simple attraction. We talked, laughed, shared stories from our childhoods, and got to know each other in a way that felt easy and natural. It reminded me of the early days with Maeve, which was bittersweet, but I pushed those thoughts aside. After our third dinner, when I walked Laura to her apartment and opened the car door for her, she softly asked if I'd like to come in. We both understood what that meant, and a rush of desire sparked through me. Once inside, she melted into my arms, and we kissed, as if we were love-struck teenagers. As we pulled back slightly, she confessed she really wanted this but was a bit nervous because it had been a while. She asked me to be gentle, and I reassured her with a smile. Gently lifting her, I asked which way to the bedroom. Later, as I lay beside her, I realized that being with Laura was both thrilling and a stark contrast to recent encounters with Maeve. Our time together was tender, affectionate, and filled with a genuine connection I hadn't felt in years. We weren't just going through the motions, we were giving each other something meaningful. The next morning, she was a bit shy again, and though we didn't make love, we parted with a sense of genuine warmth, sharing several gentle kisses. With just a few days left before Maeve's big dinner event, I kept my long-term intentions quiet with Laura but mentioned that my divorce would soon be finalized. When I got home around 9:30 on Saturday morning, I found Maeve at the kitchen table, quietly weeping. She must have guessed where I'd been. I hugged her, showing just enough sympathy to play the part. "I'm sorry, Maeve. I can imagine how you must feel," I murmured. "Oh, Daniel, this is unbearable. Just thinking of you with someone else tears me apart. I've been so selfish and blind to your feelings." She looked at me, a mixture of gratitude and sadness in her eyes. "Thank you for giving me another chance." Maeve's big night, much like mine, was fast approaching. In a way, I almost felt a hint of regret. The past 4 weeks with Maeve had been filled with intimacy and affection, and I'd actually enjoyed the closeness. But nothing she did lessened my resentment. Her betrayal had cut too deep, and any lingering love I felt for her was just a faint shadow, overwhelmed by the anger that still simmered within me. As she prepared her PowerPoint presentation, I worked alongside her, making sure it was exactly as she wanted. But in secret, I had my own version ready, a sequence of photos and videos that would expose her infidelity without naming Ron directly. In the days leading up to the event, Maeve nervously asked if I had deleted the file from weeks ago. Each time, I reassured her with a smile, even demonstrating that her presentation was intact on the laptop. The last few days at home were oddly peaceful, as Maeve seemed to believe she was winning me back. Her gestures of affection were less desperate and more genuine, even as she grappled with the pain of knowing I'd spent a night with someone else. On the big night, we arrived early. I wore a rented tuxedo, and Maeve looked radiant in a black dress with spaghetti straps that highlighted her neck and shoulders. We ran through her presentation twice to make sure everything was in place. As she leaned over to tuck her purse beneath the podium, I discreetly entered the code that would swap her presentation for mine when the moment was right. The evening unfolded just as I'd planned. We enjoyed a pleasant dinner, chatting politely with those around us. Then, Maeve was introduced with a warm welcome, and she made her way to the podium, a mix of nerves and pride on her face. I glanced at my watch. Her confidence lasted precisely 54 seconds. That's how long it took for the images of her affair to fill the screen. She didn't freeze or spill her water, but her expression shifted to one of horror as she turned to me, disbelief in her eyes. She tried to stop the presentation, but I'd made sure she couldn't. As the video clips played, the audience responded with a mixture of shock and murmurs. Maeve's face flushed as she stood there, visibly defeated, unable to react to the snide comments from the crowd. Moments later, the room cleared, leaving Maeve and me alone. I sat across the table, watching her as she tried to gather herself. Eventually, she looked up and, with a voice full of pain, asked, "Daniel, how could you do this to me? I thought you loved me." "Yes, Maeve," I replied calmly, "these past few weeks, I loved you just as much as you loved me during those 6 years of lies." I rose, walked over to the podium, and placed a stack of papers in her hand. "I'm filing for divorce. Consider yourself served. If you stay in town, we'll arrange joint custody of Lisa and Jake. If not, I'll fight for full custody, and we both know I'll win." I was almost at the door when I heard her desperate cry. "But you promised you wouldn't divorce me. You said we could work things out." Turning back to face her, I replied, "Yes, Maeve, I suppose after years of your lies, I finally lied to myself. It's been 6 months since I served Maeve those divorce papers at the charity event. The legal proceedings moved quickly, I kept my conditions clear, and Maeve, to her credit, didn't drag it out. The divorce was finalized 2 months ago, and we now share joint custody of Lisa and Jake. They don't know the full story, and I intend to keep it that way. I may not be their biological father, but I'm still their dad, and they deserve to feel secure in that love, free from adult betrayals. Life has changed since then. I've settled into a new rhythm, one that doesn't involve constantly looking over my shoulder or wondering what's true. Laura and I are seeing each other more seriously now, and while it's still early, there's a sense of peace with her that I hadn't felt in a long time. I'm cautious, but it's good to feel connected with someone again without the weight of secrets. She knows the story, and that honesty between us feels refreshing. Looking back, I've come to some conclusions, and if anyone listening to this finds themselves in a similar situation, here's my advice. Trust but verify. Love is about trust, but when that trust feels off or there's a nagging doubt, don't ignore it. It's not about being paranoid but about respecting your own instincts. Trust is sacred, but sometimes it's worth double-checking when things just don't add up. Don't let rage control you. Revenge feels satisfying, but ultimately, it doesn't fill the gaps betrayal leaves. I confronted Maeve. I made her face the consequences, but I found that forgiveness, if only for myself, was necessary to truly move forward. Letting go of anger has been the hardest part but also the most freeing. Value yourself. When Maeve cheated, I thought it was a reflection of something I lacked. But I've learned that her choices were hers alone. My worth wasn't diminished by her actions. If you're in a similar place, know that someone else's betrayal doesn't define you. And last but not least, embrace change. Divorce isn't easy. It changes the family dynamic, brings upheaval, and forces you to reinvent parts of yourself. But I've come to see that change as a chance for growth, even healing. Lean into it, take it day by day, and trust that there's life on the other side.